family liaison for the wellness partners that we work with, as well as I actually am responsible for raising funding for our research. So, I spend a lot of time holding the hands of critically ill parents and then trying to find money to help with the research, and also to help parents who have struggles to pay for the nutraceutical research because it's not covered by most insurance plans. In fact, really not covered by any insurance plans. So, and as you can imagine, as we were just talking about how there's such a tremendous lack of funding for pediatric cancer research, there's even less funding for nutraceutical pediatric cancer research. But in our research, we've been seeing some really, really promising results, and especially with brain tumors, as Marco also was saying. And we've had kids that were in clinical trials at St. Jude's that were sent home to die, and we've been able to get them to the 2 and 3 year mark, which has just been astounding with this protocol that he's developed. But, again, because funding is difficult for families because they aren't covered by insurance, we're constantly struggling. We're constantly behind the ball. But we definitely are passionate. We want to help more kids. We just have recently been in contact with a parent whose little boy is 4 years old. In 2 months, the kid gained like 80 pounds because he was put on, a steroid protocol. And we just know that the options for you guys are so grim. And we really believe that we have something here that can make a difference. We've seen with a change in diet, change in, just their overall lifestyle, and then with the protocol that Marco has come up with, and, just this focus on healthier choices, we have seen an extension of life, a better quality of life. And, who knows what also might come our way if we can really continue on with this research. So that's really our primary goal, is to continue on with the research that Marco's doing, obviously to try to raise more funding so that we can fund this research and help to save more of these kids, because there's no reason that DIPG doesn't have better answers, in terms of not even just curing, but better quality of life for these kids. And that's my main focus, is better quality of life. We don't even talk about cure. We talk about better quality of life, because for us, that's so important and so critical. And for most parents, that seems to be, really of utmost concern, especially with DIPG, because you guys have so few possibilities. So without further ado, here's Marco, our Director of Research and Development at the Pacific Nutraceutical Group and Critical One Labs.
Hi. As Lisa Marie said, I'm Marco Dydo. I'm a neuroscientist, and I'm conducting research into nutraceutical extractions and their active components in regard to pediatric cancer. So I presented or prepared a presentation today, and I gave it a title because in public speaking they always said you have to give everything a title. So I'm calling this "Demystifying the Institutional Stigma of Natural Psychoactive Phytonutrients." A lot of words there. I might need to work on that title. Anyway, we have a lot to discuss. There's a lot here. I don't know if I'm going to get through everything in the time that's allotted. We may have to redo this again, do a part 2 to try to get to. And this is just an introduction to the information, because there's so much here. So excuse me. So as we tiptoe into this discussion, I'll just get started here. It's important to realize that much of the technical biochemical information regarding this topic is very complicated, and to a large extent, very much of it is still unknown conclusively. It's like we're standing on an iceberg in a dense fog in the middle of the night. We know that we're moving. We know we're going somewhere. We know that we're standing on an iceberg, but we don't know where the water line is. We don't know how big the iceberg is. We don't know how much iceberg is underneath the water line. There's a lot about the iceberg that we don't know, and that's where we are. And that's not just me, that's your doctor, that's science in general. We just don't know a lot. We don't know more than we know. So there's a lot we don't know. But like, even within the text of all that we know lies this bitter truth of how little we actually control. And I know that a lot of you have felt the pain of how little we actually control in regard to especially DIPG. And so now for some of you, this presentation is going to be a review of what you already know. I think a lot of you are kind of up to speed and you know a lot of this. And there are some of you that have, chemistry backgrounds, biology backgrounds and whatnot. So some of this is stuff you already know. For others, it might be an expansion of what you already somewhat are familiar with. And for others, this is going to be like a foreign language, and like a dead foreign language, like Mesopotamian, And I'm going to do my best to attempt to explain and demystify some of the concepts of nutricokinetics and nutricokinetics. So there's the first big word. And it's just, all that means, it's the study of the metabolism of the movement of natural plant-based compounds through the body, just like pharmacokinetics, which is pharma drugs. This is nutricokinetics, which is nutraceuticals, which are plant-based compounds. And yeah, when you see my hand, I'm Italian, I do this. So if you see my hand moving, that's what's going on. It has a mind of its own. It just sort of does its thing. So I hope it's not too distracting. I'll try to keep it out of the line of the camera. I'm seeing it in my there it is. Yeah.
Marco,
Okay.
I can appreciate that. When I
Yeah.
was in social work school, I kept getting points knocked off because I was using my hands to talk.
Hands so much. Yeah,
It's
okay.
just,
So
they say it's distracting to clients. I love it.
I have a lot to cover, and I have to sit on my hand. So so this presentation is going to seem a bit disjointed because I'm going to jump around a bit. There's so much detail in this subject matter to fully cover any of it with the time constraint of this format and beyond. I mean, there's just so much there. So I'm gonna introduce some of the science behind nutraceuticals and phytonutrient extractions, and I'm gonna attempt to bring it together at the end. So you might have to be patient and put on your ears, and I'm gonna sort of stop abruptly at places, because the next step is like a master's class in that piece of this, and we just don't have the time to go there. So I'm going to try to give you my best shot here, and so that's what I'm going to try to do. So the seemingly idiosyncratic use of medicinal plants and the reasoning behind taking them is that these plants affect our overall wellness and consciousness in several positive ways. And I feel that they represent the future of healthcare. And we're seeing so many studies being done now with plant matter, not just pharmaceuticals. Now, either in an everyday sort of way, where plants that alter consciousness and overall wellness, like in a minor way, like the effects we get from tea or coffee, or for those people who have done tobacco or even alcohol as a plant product, or in more radical ways, where we see the use of psychoactive plants as medicinal alternatives, or even plants as the basic starting point blueprint for many synthetic pharmaceutical drugs that are currently in use today. So about 95% of the world's population currently today completely addicted to the drug/compound caffeine. And we accept this like it's totally normal, like it's all okay. But conversely, many people look at compounds like cannabinoids as if they are the evil spawn of Satan. And that lie is simply part of the propaganda campaign started many years ago by the petrochemical conglomerate to squelch the competition and the utilization of their cheaper oil alternatives. So before I continue, let's understand that the whole of what we know in science, doctors and everything, it's just, I want to restate this, is only a speck in comparison to what we don't know. That's That's really important. So everything that I'm going to tell you is kind of, oh, it's all cutting edge and sounds like there's a lot here, and there is, but there's so much that we don't know. We're really on just the tip of that iceberg. And we'll come back to this iceberg motif a couple of times here. So hopefully we understand what that means now. So now it starts to get a little more complicated, like even in the terminology, because we have to use words like exogenous. And exogenous means, biochemically and physiologically speaking, being created outside the body. So exogenous means outside the body, and endogenous, which means compounds created inside the body. So now what you're missing in the current popular evil spawn of Satan narrative is that these very same exogenous psychoactive substances found like in cannabis, marijuana, like delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol or THC or cannabidiol, CBD, and these ligand compounds are also produced endogenously, so inside the body. So we find them outside the body in this plant, in cannabis. We also find the same compounds as neurotransmitters, like anandamide, AEA, you've probably seen that like bandied about. And it was just essentially internally produced THC. And then there's a bunch of them, but there's another one that we have to mention, and it's 2-arachidonyl glycerol, it's 2-AG, which is actually internally produced CBD. And these compounds have the ability to affect our overall wellness and provide the homeostatic oversight of our internal biochemical, physiological, and circadian systems. And they can even alter our metabolism, our immune response, our actual perception of our consciousness, which raises some really important questions about consciousness itself. But that's beyond the scope of what we're talking about today. Well, maybe we can talk about consciousness some other time. But with these compounds, they do one of the most important aspects of these compounds is what I said before about circadian rhythms and what that is. Circadian rhythms are the natural rhythms within inside the body that make stuff. So like women, your reproductive system is on a 28-day cycle. That's a circadian rhythm. And in that rhythm, you produce different hormones at different times, and like FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, and like that, and luteinizing hormone, and all these different hormones are produced at a different time. And then you see the end result in your body as you go through that 28-day cycle. So those are compounds that these compounds that I just talked about control or really give oversight to the circadian rhythms, like all of them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. So getting back to like endogenous AEA and 2-AG, they're just, simply ligands of exogenous THC and CBD. That's what they are. They're kind of the same thing. One's made inside the body, one's made inside the plant. So then you go like, well, what are ligands? So now let me explain what a ligand is. And from a biochemistry standpoint, ligands are defined as any molecule that irreversibly, or really molecule or atom that irreversibly binds to a receiving protein molecule or receptor. So you've all talked about receptors, and that's kind of a big thing these days. So and then their ligands are broken up into several sort of subsets, and there are two types that we sort of need to address right now. One is called orthosteric, which orthosteric ligands interact with the same binding site as, so the exogenous compounds interact with the same binding site as the endogenous compound, like neurotransmitters or hormones, or like AEA and THC. They both bind to the same site. Where allosteric ligands bind at separate sites on the receptor, which besides this, that gives us like several advantages over the orthosteric model, because they can compete for multiple binding sites. So like 2AG and CBD are like that. So there are more sites for the CBD to actually bind to, more receptor sites for the CBD to bind to, where the THC only binds at one site because it's orthosteric. So when you start talking about like how these compounds are taken up, you have to sort of take into consideration what compounds are we talking about and what receptors are we talking about. And we'll talk a little bit more about receptors in a minute as well.
And Marco,
So,
I wanted to just clarify a little bit. I think most
Okay.
of us are it's parents and caregivers. So
Uh-huh.
I think some of the science is a little bit beyond us.
Okay.
And we
Well,
kind of
but
love to know how
okay.
how it can really help with the
Okay.
the
So
GIPG clients. I
I'm
mean,
getting
this
there.
sounds okay, perfect. It sounds
I'm getting there.
fabulous. I was just getting
Okay.
a little lost.
Yeah. Well, listen, if you only retain a small percentage of this, that's great. Because you're not gonna get this the first time. But it is kind of important that you have an exposure to this, because when we start talking about things like apoptosis, and you kind of need to have some of this science at least near your wheelhouse, like outside looking in the window. It doesn't have to be inside, but it needs to be around, like you have had an exposure to it, and it's something that you can kind of address, so you can have an understanding as to how this stuff works, because it is a little mystifying. And we're talking about compounds that have been, like I said, I want to demystify some of the misnomers about these compounds. There's a lot of misunderstanding and a lot of misinformation out there from a lot of companies. And again, I'm getting there. I'm pushing toward that as quickly as I can.
Thank you.
So yeah. So when you start talking about like exogenous chemical carcinogens and xenochemicals, and what actually what causes carcinogenesis and all of that, there's a whole bunch of information in regard to how that process begins and how it proceeds. But I think I won't talk about neoplastic proliferation. Maybe we can talk about that at some other point in the future. But I just do want to say in regard to carcinogenesis that it can be in like 3 stages. Carcinogenesis is in 3 stages. Remember the iceberg analogy before, where we had the tip of the iceberg, the waterline of the iceberg, and then everything below the water of the iceberg. Is we have initiation of any neoplastic growth, and the initiation is something that's underneath the waterline. That's something that we just don't really have a handle on. A lot of theories, a lot of talk about it. Then there's the promotion of carcinogens and cancer, and that's kind of at the waterline, a little bit above, so we know a little bit more. And then the 3rd stage is progression, and we know a lot about progression because that's the thing that we've all lived through. We've all lived through the progression of neoplastic proliferation and advance. So that's something that we know, and it's currently assumed that exposure to endogenous and exogenous chemicals, combined with like human gene expression and external noxious environmental interactions with all kinds of nasty stuff out in the world, are what is responsible for the carcinogenesis, what starts this, toxic chemical carcinogens and all of that. So there's a lot there. Polymorphisms of cancer susceptibility genes, and just there's a ton there.
So how do you help DIPG kids?
Well, we have to talk a little bit about endocannabinoids and the endocannabinoid system.
Do you just have
So-
London, who's a DIPG child at the moment, or do you have more kids?
No, we've had others. We've had other kids that we've worked with DIPG, and you were there in the very beginning before we started the talk when I was talking about how with DIPG, we usually wind up working with these kids when they're sent home because their doctors have run out of options. So we get them in the very last stages. And so it becomes very, very difficult for us to have any real impact on kids with DIPG when we get them in those late stages, because a lot of their systems are already sort of torn down. And in discussing like the endocannabinoid system, it's basically comprised of like receptors and all of these like multiple endogenous lipid derivatives like AEA and 2AG. See, this is why it's important that I sort of covered some of that before, that you know what this stuff is and what the difference between endogenous and exogenous compounds are. Because these compounds that are in these plants, your body already makes. And it's, it's in breast milk. It's one of the first things that when a mother breastfeeds for the first time, there's a copious amount of AEA and 2AG in the breast milk. And the theory is that it stimulates the newborn's immune system.
So is that what you do? You kind of stimulate the immune system?
Well, it is. There's a lot that we do. And again, I'm going to get to that. I kind of need to get us there. If I just start talking about, if I skip through so much of this information, it's not going to make a lot of sense. I mean, we can give that a shot if you'd like. I mean, if you guys want me to just jump right into, because I wanted to talk a little bit about the CB1 and CB2 receptors and, just how all this works. But I mean, I can talk about how the endocannabinoid system, is a critical, like I said, is a critical participant in the circadian rhythm oversight, PTSD reduction, Alzheimer's, of course, cancer, how it and what it actually does. And, I already tried to explain circadian rhythm and what that system is and how it functions. But I mean, there's a lot there. I could do a whole talk on just circadian rhythms. When I did research for NASA, it was one of the things that we focused on. So I kind of was there on the ground floor of the circadian rhythm system and how it actually functions. But we can kind of just move on. So let me just say this, that cannabinoids have been used for centuries as part of a palliative care protocol, to alleviate pain and nausea and stimulate appetite like that. And more recently, cell and culture, and animal studies have shown, an anti-tumoral or apoptotic effect of cannabinoids in various cancer types. So now we get into, like, my research has expanded that theory to include an increased bioavailability, intracellular residency, anti-mitotic and anti-angiogenic activity, to name some of the things that we have addressed. And I'll explain all that. So the most important thing that we've done is we have demonstrated an ability to cross the blood-brain barrier. So we've been able to deliver compounds directly into the central nervous system. And that's the key right there. that we've been able to do that. So I kind of like
do
the,
that?
well, that not easily, not easily. So it kind of comes down to like a difference of philosophies, like the pharmaceutical versus nutraceutical approach, where, you know, in pharmacology, they pretty much, you know, their approach is kill it locally and toxically. And in nutraceuticals, we're like, heal it systemically and naturally. So with a pharmaceutical approach, they look for compounds, for toxic compounds that will seek out, remember those ligands that we talked about, those receptors? They look for compounds that will be attracted to that receptor on the cancer, and then will kill it. That's kind of roughly their approach. Our approach is completely different. Trying to cut through a lot of the technical stuff because
I'm curious, like when
our,
if a family comes to you a little earlier than right at the end, you know, is it that they're kind of like taking medicine or doing alternative treatments? You know, kind of what kind of tangible things are available to them?
well, we have an entire protocol that we have developed. So in yeah. So there are things I feel are real important to say before we kind of delve into that. You know, I don't want to come across as throwing the you know, pharmaceutical industry under the bus here with some of my comments. You know, I've taught people who went into the pharmaceutical industry. You know, they were my students, and you know, and I've had people within the pharmaceutical industry as consultants in the work that I'm doing. So I think it's the individuals are well intended. I think it's the larger organizations that's where the problem is, because it's about the money, unfortunately. But by the same token, I'm not a guy who's waving this banner about, you know, yay for like everyone who's doing it naturally, because yeah, that's not good either. There's a lot of like false snake oil hope being sold out there. And it's kind of like, you know, my warning. And, you know, like people who are out there going, it's natural and organic. And I always say that, you know, we're charging grizzly bears both natural and organic, but you should, you know, do your best to stay out of his way. You know, there's a lot of claims out there that I've heard, and, you know, I won't go into them. So I just think that, you know, you've got to be really careful and mindful about what you do and who you listen to, and what the science behind what they're doing is, because there's a lot of science that's out there that is just science-y. What they've done is they've taken the information from the recreational cannabis industry for the last 50 years, and they've made it sound science-y. They haven't really done any real hard science with this. They've just made it sound just science-y enough to make people feel like they know what they're talking about, but they really don't. You know, there's a lot about the cultivation of these plants, that, you know, how things should be, how they should be cultivated. You know, we cultivate hydroponically, aeroponically, aquaponically. You know, everything that we do is from cloning, and there's a million and one reasons why. You know, we just from the ground up, the way that we have addressed this is just to love it, essentially, and to try to preserve the entire phytonutrient profile. So the questions that you're asking me about, well, what do you do? Without knowing what we're doing in the lab, it's not just, oh, here's a pill, or here's a handful of pills, or it's actually the process that goes into, the cultivation, the harvesting, the thermally labile compounds that are lost in these plants when other people do this, how these compounds are lost in the drying process, and much less their extraction protocols. Our extraction protocol was or is a piece of equipment that I did research for 30 years and developed this reactor. And it's this adiabatic isothermal process, and it's very complicated. It's 14 different processes. It's 1,787 steps. It takes about 3.5 to 4 weeks to do. It's just, but the bottom line is, after all of this is done, after we complete all of this, we wind up preserving the entire primary metabolites of the plant. So when any plant that you eat, any plant that you go out and get, there are primary metabolites in it, nutrients and phytonutrients and all of that. But through our process, we encourage the development of secondary and tertiary metabolites. And the best way I can describe that to you is if you have a grape growing in your backyard, you pick the grape, you eat the grape, you had a grape, good. If you take that grape and you squeeze it, and you have grape juice and you drink and you have grape juice, well, that's good too. But if you take that grape juice and you process it a certain way, you wind up with wine. And it's nothing like a grape and nothing like grape juice. It's completely different. And it's because in the fermentation process, you wind up creating all these secondary and tertiary metabolites. And that's why wine does what it does and produces the things that it does and has the flavor profile that it does, is because of the secondary and tertiary metabolites. Now, we're not doing a fermentation process, but in our process, we are creating these secondary and tertiary metabolites. And the thing that's special about that, with what we're doing, is that there's no standard for it. And what that means is these compounds that we're creating, no one's ever seen before. They're like Mother Nature's kitchen, and no one's ever put them together this way before. And they're in very small amounts, very, very small molecules to boot. And it's within these secondary and tertiary metabolites that theoretically, what I feel is where we're having what I was talking about before when I said enhanced bioavailability with our compounds. So enhanced bioavailability means that we're able to get the cells to absorb these compounds. We enhance the absorption of these compounds. We've enhanced intercellular residency. That means that we've enhanced the time that these compounds stay within the cells. So it's these small molecules. They're like lipid messenger cells. They're precursors. They're cofactors. They're all these things. It's kind of like if you had a Ferrari out in your driveway and you didn't have the key to it, so the Ferrari is kind of the active ingredient. When people talk about, oh, you've got to have so many milligrams of THC or so many milligrams of CBD, and no, you don't, because you need the whole car. You need the keys, the gas, the tires. You need all of it. And that's what we've done. We have been able to go out and extract these compounds from these plants and retain them, plus develop these secondary and tertiary metabolites. And we think, again, theoretically, because this is all brand new, that this is where we have been able to have the results that really no one else has been able to have. We have other plants that we do extractions from. We've been around the world and we've gotten plants that that have shown to have, anti-angiogenic properties. So, anti-angiogenic essentially means that, neoplastic cells are, they're brilliant at sequestering blood supply. And it's a really peculiar and very specific kind of blood supply that you don't see in the rest of the body. You only see it in tumors and cancer cells. But we have compounds that stop that. So they stop that blood sequestration. We cut off their food supply.
Now,
we have
what do you do with
compounds.
the IPG kids? Like, is that kind of what you did with London?
Well,
Helped her?
so what I said before about what pharmaceutical companies do is they look at cancer like it's individual. And they have all these different names based on where they found it, where, and one of the things that I wanted to get into earlier was sort of how these cells, where they start and where they, how they're initiated. And again, maybe one day we can come back to that. We can just talk about that specifically, that initiation, because where you find, quote unquote, cancer isn't necessarily where it started. So these cells, these neoplastic cells, these mutated cells start somewhere, and then they are released into your system, lymphatic system, blood system, cardiovascular system, and they float around the body looking for a safe harbor. Now, we have a system in our body, again, run by it's part of circadian rhythms. It's, your immune system, and it looks for foreign bodies and it's supposed to get rid of them because we all have mutations. You, me, all of us. We have mutations. We create them all the time. But what happens is something happens to that system, that identification of that mutated cell. It doesn't see it as a foreign body anymore. So this mutated cell tricks the body into seeing that it's not a foreign body, that it's part of you. And it finds a safe harbor. Sometimes it's the brain, sometimes it's the liver, sometimes it's the spleen, sometimes it's wherever. And it latches on and begins to proliferate. Now you have a neoplasm. You got cancer. And it tricks the body. So before I talked about apoptosis, I don't know how many of you are familiar with that idea, but I'll just go over it real quickly here. Apoptosis is programmed cell death. It's in every cell. It's a process and a program. So the program of it is every cell that you have, it has a timeline attached to it. It's born, it lives, it dies, and it's in its genetic code. It's just programmed into it. So because every cell has another cell that's going to come along and replace it. So the cell lives its life, does its thing, whatever its thing is, and then it packages itself up. And so there's a process to it. The process to the program is how it does that. It packages itself up into these little vacuoles, and it sends those vacuoles get sent off to the liver, and they get, sort of metabolized and broken up, and some things are saved and, catabolized, and some things are excreted, and you move on your way. One of the things about, like, when you get a virus, the reason why you feel so crappy when you get a virus is as those viral cells start to burst, it sends all that toxic cytotoxic material into your bloodstream. Instead of wrapping it up in little vacuoles and sending it off to the liver, it just is released into the bloodstream. And that's why you feel the way you feel when you have the flu. That's what's happening. So with apoptosis, programmed cell death, the cells don't just lyse and burst and release all of their waste product and whatnot into your bloodstream, they move off slowly and quick, and nicely, and you know, in a like, you know, when we were in grade school and we all got in line and we went to outside to play like good little children, like that, just like that. Cancer cells have shut off apoptosis. So cancer cells are immortal, essentially. The thing that kills them is when you shut off their food supply. When you die, then they die. So that's pretty much what kills them. So somehow they're very stealthy and they've been able to shut off the program and the process of apoptosis. What we have found with these compounds is that they turn on apoptosis. So when you look at DIPG specifically, or really any name the cancer specifically, at their least common denominator, they all are angiogenic. They are all mutagenic. They are, you know, they all like divide. So there's like mitosis that happens all the time. We have compounds that are anti-angiogenic, anti-mutagenic, anti-mitotic. And these are from plants, again, that we've gotten from around the world. And we've also been able to show that we are turning on apoptosis in these cells. So when you say, have you been able to do this with DIPG? With so many of the DIPG people that we've worked with, we get them so late in the game that, see, none of this is like a really big ship that you have to turn around slowly, and time is not your friend in regard to this. You really have to be so early in regard to this. You know, with the leptomeningeal, because it's in the meninges, it's kind of easier to get to. So we can cross the blood-brain barrier, get right into the meninges, and apply these compounds directly to it. And I mean, we had a little girl that was sent home from St. Jude, and she was given 6 weeks to live. And that they said, that's it. So there's nothing else we can do. So she wasn't on anything. She did our protocol, and that was 3.5 or 4 years ago now. And she's in school and she's fine. So, you know, no one ever says cure, because we don't know. Because again, we're so under the gun here. You know, we've put all of our money into this research that we're doing, and it's not cheap. It's, you know, it's just not. And we're so underfunded, and we have, you know, there's equipment that we need to continue this research. But what we have been able to show is that we can address these neoplasms regardless of their origin, regardless of where they are. We've been able to show that we've addressed them. And even with, like, we've had some kids with DIPG who, you know, we've been able to arrest it, but then their doctors put them on, you know, carboplatin or some other just really toxic compound, and they wind up, you know, dying, because all that stuff is toxic. It just is. There's poisons. There's just poisons. It's, you know, that's just what they are. You know, I can't find another way to say that's nicer or more acceptable. I just, you know, I've tried to be as nice as I can in the past about it, but I'm just at a point now where I'm like, well, you know, you've got to call it what it is, you know, because the bottom line is, with all of this stuff, you know, I don't believe in any of it, because I can't. Belief means that I'm looking for some kind of, you know, confirmation bias. I'm expecting an outcome. I'm not expecting any outcome. As a scientist, I just have to look at the result and you know, just call it as I see it, and not have a hope or you know, some kind of vision about what it might do. I just have to look at what it is actually doing. And what it's actually doing is, like I keep saying, we've enhanced bioavailability, intracellular residency, anti-angiogenic properties, anti-mutagenic properties, anti-mitotic properties, apoptosis activation. That stuff we've seen. So I can say all that stuff because we've seen it. But beyond that, I just have to, what I have to do as a scientist is just maintain my vision on what's actually happening and not develop some belief system in the work that I'm doing. And that's part of the discipline.
Yeah. So if we had any parents who wanted to take their kids to see you, what would that protocol kind of look like?
Well, yeah, so there's a lot of moving parts to it. It's not just a pill. I was asked a while ago about, what's the most important thing of, like, this work that you're doing, and I thought about it, and I thought about some of the compounds and some of these plants, and how difficult they are to cultivate, and where we had to get them from, and and then the actual compounds themselves, and how there's a lot that we can't talk about because this is all research, and I have to account for confirmation bias. If I tell you, oh, there's a lot of vitamin C in it, then you'll think, well, then if I do a lot more vitamin C, it just makes you think that because you think you're doing one compound or another, that it's going to, you're going to expect some outcome one way or the other. And that gets in the way of the reality of what's happening, where I need to see what's actually happening. So we have to kind of keep it as a blind study, where we don't really talk about the specificity of the compounds. And that's an issue for some people, because of, people think, well, it's cannabis, so it's THC and it's CBD. And I'm like, yeah, not really. Not really. Because we create those secondary and tertiary metabolites, it's a completely different compound. So within our protocol, so we have this protocol that's a 6-month protocol that we call C3. Within that, there are a number of compounds that you wind up taking, and you take them at different times. There's this idea that we call surging. The way the body works, the way our metabolisms work is, if you drink, 3 liters of water every day, your body will then set a threshold and expect 3 liters of water every day. And it'll absorb as much as it needs, and then it'll excrete the rest. If you then change that, you start to take more, or you start to take less, it sort of throws the body a curve. So what we want to do is we want to maximize the bioavailability. That's why we talked about that before. We want to maximize bioavailability, how much they'll actually absorb. And we want to minimize the amount that you need to take to get to that point. But then we want to fluctuate and sometimes stop taking it all together, because then we want the body to be, starved for a moment of some of those compounds, because it will lower that threshold. It'll absorb more. There's been a lot of studies done. I worked with Linus Pauling, who the vitamin C guy and Nobel laureate and whatever, for when I was in NASA. And he used to talk about vitamin C, and he used to take like a bunch, but they went toward the end of his life, they did this study, and he was like really amazed to see that if you take, 6 grams, he was taking 10 grams of vitamin C every day, that the body in the beginning starts, it absorbs, 70, 75, 80% of those compounds. But if you do it and it becomes habitual, you taking it all the time, it reduces the amount it'll absorb down to 10%. So you wind up just excreting most of it. And that's not what we want. We want the body to be at its maximum uptake while we're taking it. Then we want to sort of throw it a curveball, stop taking those compounds, start taking other compounds, and then ramp that up. So everything is about ramping up and ramping down. So it's about surging. So our protocol is complex in that sense. And then within the 6-month protocol, there are 2 6-week protocols that we call CART. And CART is a number of capsules, and it's all, you get it in a package and a kit, and it's pretty self-explanatory. It always seems daunting when people first get it, when they first have to talk to us about it. But we have done this before, and we've walked people through it, and it's really not as difficult as it looks in the beginning. So there's that part, but then there's also, because we have this theory that we want to have these compounds delivered through several different portals. We have a transdermal compound that you put on the skin. So we have been able to show that we're able to get these compounds into your body through your skin. So that's in a nutshell what it looks like. But beyond that, beyond the the pills and the salves and all of that stuff, all of that, there's a dietary component to this. There's a symbiotic system component to this, where we look at your GI tract, and because that's where your immune system lives, and that's where all immune processes start. So we have sort of pre, pro, and postbiotic compounds that we have created in our lab that that we supplement with. So we have all of that as well. But even beyond that, there's diet. So we really feel it's important that people eat a certain diet, because we have found that it supplements and supports these compounds that you're getting. So that's important. But even beyond that, all of this stuff is strongly influenced and directly correlated to this idea of set and setting. And this is what I kind of came up with when someone asked me what's the most important thing of all of this. Because they're all important in and of themselves, but when you look at the bigger picture, this idea of set and setting is really the most important thing, because it's essentially the mindset of the individual and the setting, the environment that they're occupying. It's kind of like an internal external environment that influences the depth of your experience and the overall therapeutic effectiveness. We work with a lot of people who are Christian, and so I always say to them, look, here's the bottom line. If Jesus walked in the room and handed you a pill and said that this pill will fix all of your earthly problems, if you didn't believe it was Jesus, the pill probably wouldn't work. There's so many papers and so much research done on, the power of positive thinking and mindset and where you're at. It's like, we always say to people, it's okay to, if you cry, you're mad, you're angry, that's fine. But for every minute that you're crying, every minute that you're angry, every minute that you're pissed off, you have to spend 3 minutes laughing. So you just have to do that. That becomes your work. Because the people that we've had the biggest impact on are people who have really worked on their overall outlook, their set and setting. They put themselves, like the little girl that I talked about earlier with leptomeningeal carcinomatosis, for that 6 weeks, her family took her on a trip. They rented a Winnebago, and she wanted to see the United States, so off they went. So, was it my protocol that, quote unquote, saved her? Or was it something that was psychosomatic, that because she was doing this protocol and she was with these people that loved her and they showed her this really awesome experience of taking her around the country, that cured her? People talk about psychosomatics as being a bad thing. I don't care if it's your brain that's healing you, fine, good, that's great. Exactly what does it isn't really, I don't really care about that, as long as we can figure it out. And so with all of that being said, it's all of it's important. There isn't one bit of it that is, the all important aspect of it. I think that the dietary piece is vitally important. I think the symbiotic piece is vitally important. I think the C3 and the CART protocol, I think there are compounds in there that absolutely have a negative impact on neoplastic proliferation. And they're definitely compounds that there are no side effects, absolutely none. You can't overdose on any of this stuff. It's essentially food and food products. So there's no, I mean, the worst side effect we get from people is that sometimes, their kids are a little happy and they get a little giggly, and or sometimes a little sleepy. And that's not a bad side effect in comparison to some of the side effects that we have seen. And we have seen some horrible side effects from some of the toxic compounds that, that they're being offered.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure.
How do you know? I mean, since you're not doing biopsies or seeing there's blood vessels, how do you know these products are anti-neoplastic, anti-angiogenic? How do you know that?
Well, we work pretty closely with a lot of oncologists, people who don't formally work with us, but they're interested in the work that we're doing. And we've seen scans, and it's through interpretation of the scans, we've seen cystic cavitation within neoplastic growth. So we see that. Then the theory is that the cells start to break up from their origin. So the inside of the neoplasm starts to break down first. And we've seen this time and time again with these compounds, that when you start to look at these these scans, the margins look bigger, but they're not circumscribed. They're very broken up and very clouded. And the inside of the neoplasm is essentially a big hole. And I always tell people, kind of like a jelly donut. That's kind of what happens. So we're seeing that these cells are dying, and we're seeing that when you look at, when they do contrast studies, the uptake is way down that in comparison to previous scans. So that means that if the contrast medium isn't getting in, there's no blood supply. It can't get in. So that's why we're saying that we're seeing this anti-angiogenic effect, because the contrast medium isn't getting in. And so we're looking, so you're right, we're not in a place where we can do biopsy. We're not in a place where we're kind of have our hands tied. However, we do have MRI scan, we have CAT scan, we have PET, we've got all of that to look at. Plus, we look at blood work, we look at all of it. We really look at everything that there is to look at. And we consult with a lot of oncologists, and we look at all the reports. We pore over all of the reports and put together a clinical impression of what we're seeing. And what's interesting is this whole idea of cystic cavitation was something that I suggested to an oncologist several years ago, and he was unconvinced. And then he started to really look at it. He brought it around to a number of different röntgenologists who looked at the scans, and then they all came back and said, no, we agree with him. That's exactly what this is. And we missed it. We've been missing this. We didn't really see it that way. He just sort of saw it and then, you know, put another perspective on it. So, you know, when I say that there's a lot we don't know, there's a lot we don't know. There's a lot we don't know. So we're kind of, you know, a lot of what I say about even the work that we're doing, a lot of it's theoretical. But clinically, those theories appear like they're being fleshed out. But again, I don't know definitively. I can't say, oh, it's a cure. I can't say that. I can't say any of that. I can say that we have had some very, very, very promising results and absolutely no side effects. As a matter of fact, we've worked with kids who have been in intractable pain from, you know, opioids, and you know, one boy who was in just so much pain from the wind of the air conditioner on his legs. And we got him home singing Christmas carols with his family that year, and he had no pain. He was kind of on the mend, and he got sick later on, and you know, he was so debilitated because, again, we get these kids when they're so far down the road, and we require an intact, you know, immune system, and you know, ionizing radiation takes that away. So many times we're just left with, you know, a very broken system, and we're doing the best that we can. And with many people, it's becomes a question of quality of life and not quantity. But we've had both. We've had both.
And if
you know,
families if we wanted to refer families to you all for more information, what's the best way to do that?
Lisa Marie.
Okay. Through email
she's-
or?
Yeah, email's great, or I mean, they can call me. We're available 24/7. We do a pretty thorough intake form that we have people fill out. We request access to their medical portal so that we can access all of their scans and blood work. And we also ask to get copies of the discs of their scans, because it's a lot easier for Marco to evaluate the disc than trying to see it on a computer. And then once we have all that information from them, Marco reviews all of the information, and then we come back to the family and give them an idea of what we would recommend for their loved one.
About how long does it generally take to get a recommendation back?
Well, it depends on how quickly they get the information to us. You know, as soon as we get it, and especially with kids who are obviously really far down the line, we try to get it, you know, within a couple of days. Once we have all of the scans and information, we don't even necessarily have to have the hard copy of the scan to have an idea of what we want to do with them, but we do like to eventually have the hard copy so Marco can really look at, you know, the scans, because we find so often, like I think was saying earlier, that in the reports that we see, there's so much cutting and pasting that it's obvious that they're doing a lot of cutting and pasting to kind of fall under what they need to be saying for the insurance companies. So he really likes to look at the scans himself, because it gives him a better idea of what's really going on. But once we have the intake form filled out and I have access to the medical portal, generally we can get back with them in about probably 3 or 4 days with an idea of what the protocol will look like.
Okay, and do they have to go visit you guys in California, or can you guys?
Nope, we do everything over the phone. So
Well, at some point in time, it would be nice if we could put a clinic together where we could
it
work
would
with
be
people
great.
directly. That would be
It would be great. Yeah, that's our dream. But at this point in time, if they're in California, it's great. We'll get together with them. But yeah, no, we can do pretty much everything that we do over the phone.
And there's formats like this, Zoom,
Yeah.
So we can talk to people that way. We can look at, how things are progressing. We can meet with the family and see everyone and see how they're interacting and all of that, because all that's important. Again, it becomes part of the clinical picture. So, it's not, we're very hands-on and we're very inclusive. From the food that not only are they feeding their child, but the food the family's eating we really do get involved in like I said, the setting, the environmental setting, the family, what's going on in the family, what's all that about, that becomes an integral piece of the overall kind of, wellness protocol.
One of the first kids we worked with, her mother contacted me and she's like, I just can't do chemotherapy anymore with my daughter. I'm killing her and I just can't do it. And so we talked about diet and she said, did I do this to my kid because we went to McDonald's all the time? And I said, I never say that you did this to your kid, no, but stop McDonald's. And she said the next day they stopped McDonald's, they went on a plant-based diet immediately. And within, I think, 2 weeks, the mother had lost like 15 pounds and she was so thrilled. So all the kids went on a plant-based diet, all the kids lost weight, they're all healthier. And she's like one of our, the people that always talks about, oh, plant-based is the best way to go, because she immediately saw her health improve. So we're pretty adamant about that, pretty adamant about plant-based diet. And you don't have to, just stop overnight, but it definitely seems to be easier if you just kind of stop cold turkey.
I'm sure some others may have some questions, but I want to make sure we get to those questions. I don't know if Scott or Ben, anyone.
Hey, not all at once.
Right.
One thing I'm wondering about is for people who finish treatment and are stable, is there room for any work to be done with them?
So
DIPG or other brain tumors?
So when you mean finished with our treatment or finished with their treatment?
Traditional treatment.
Finished with treatment.
Let's
Well,
say
like I said,
it's hard with brain tumors, but to have said, they're, no evidence of disease essentially is what they're hearing from oncology. So is there
not for the IPG, you just can say stable the IPG, not rarely that happens.
Yes.
So
yes. So I'm curious with all brain tumors, is there
again, we're on real thin ice with that question and kind of in the dark. I always tell people I feel like a small child in a dark room reaching for a light switch that I can't quite get to yet. And we do have protocols for people, moving forward after treatment, because what the medical profession does is they deal with things they can see. So they're not looking at individual cells, and they're not addressing the instigating factors in what started that neoplastic growth. So is it still there? Is that system still broken? Maybe, probably. I don't know. We don't have a test for it, but there are compounds that you can take sort of prophylactically to address, the endocannabinoid system, to enhance that, to help with apoptosis, to help with, because we're seeing it have that effect with cancer patients. We're seeing people who have gone on sort of like a long-term program, and 10 years later they're cancer free. So again, that initiator, we don't really know what that is just yet. So that's one of the things that we would like to look for. It's one of the things we would like to try to identify, is how the whole thing starts. Because if you can find the initiator, well, I think what most approaches do is it's kind of like there's a guy, you know, outside your front door, and every day you come home, he stabs you. And you come in and you put a Band-Aid on. And you, you know, you make sure that you're well stocked in Band-Aids and Neosporin, and, you know, and you're doing your best to make sure that you know, stop the bleeding. But what we should really be doing is trying to get that guy away from your front door with a knife in the first place, so that initiator. Then you wouldn't have to worry about all the other stuff. And that's kind of what we need to do. That's where we need to go. And we're not there. No one, doctors, no one's looking at that, because unfortunately there's no money in it.
Are you looking at it?
Money's in the maintenance. Well, I'm looking at it only sort of retrospectively right now. I don't have the equipment to really investigate it. So I can only look at it retrospectively and make some guesses at what I think it might be based on the results that we're seeing with the work that we're doing currently. But I would love to start going in that direction. It's really the new frontier, is what are the initiators of this? Because ask any doctor, what caused this? I don't know. No one knows. No one knows. Who's looking? I mean, there aren't a lot of people looking, because again, the money's in the maintenance of a disease. Every disease is maintain it. Maintain your diabetes, maintain it. Take this drug and maintain. No one's looking to cure it. No one's looking at what those initiators are. So, you know, so not only how do we shut down the initiator, how do we keep the initiator from happening in the first place? There's the real question. So, you know, I always tell people it's not about answers. It's about, you know, it's about asking the right question. So we have to ask the right questions. So we have to start there. So the right question is, you know, what's the initiator?
Yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for joining us. Does anybody else have any questions? I know we've taken up a little bit more of your time. Sorry about that. I know we were supposed to end at 7:30, so sorry about that, Marco and Lisa.
No, it's fine.
No, thank you. Thank you so
Yeah.
much for facilitating this. And, you know, quickly, I just did want to say that I think it was Jess, I'm not sure who asked the question, but in terms of people that are NED and the kids that are NED with us, they do stay on a cannabinoid protocol forever. It's significantly reduced. They do a couple of drops every night, but they do stay on.
Well, it's microdosing.
Yeah, and so they do stay on it even after they've been declared NED.
All right. Well, thank you for clarifying that.
Thank
Sure.
you.
Sure. Thank you
Okay.
all so much for joining
Yeah,
us.
thank you.
All
Bye.
right. Bye,
Okay,
everyone.
take care. Good night, everyone.
Bye.
Okay,
Take
bye.
care.